All right, we're moving into chapter 10, and we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about family functioning, really looking at some of the dynamics that happen as we're working with families. So, without any further ado, we're going to move ahead into our conversation for the rest of the class. Social work practice with families. And so when we're thinking about families, we want to also recognize and understand that the definition of family has evolved over time, and so it looks very, very different. Also, just to back up a little bit, what we're hoping to get out of, or what you should take away from chapter 10, is really starting to get some understanding that assessment involves gathering information and synthesizing it into like a working hypothesis. Also, um, understanding the family as a social system and that it's organized in predictable roles and relationships, recognize the diversity and appreciate that within the family as a part of that assessment, understand how to assess those strengths and resources, and things to keep in mind when you are actually conducting that family assessment. So those are some of the things that we want to take away from our learning on today. So again, when we think about defining families, we think about families that have been arranged by marriage or remarriage or adoption, birth, kin, friends, social networks, cultural communities, nannies, surrogates, all of those folks make up families, or what defines a family. And family functions are basically, are looked at as the informal welfare system in our society, and that the family has certain functions and responsibilities that attend to the social and educational, health and well-being and mutual care of its participants. So we've got family stressors also that are things that work on that particular system. There are stressors that are formative and non-formative, um, or normative rather, that impact how families actually function. And so thinking about things like um, neighborhoods that people live in, or whether there is racial discrimination or economic discrimination based on what's happening for a family will affect how that family functions in court and works in the context of our community and our society. Um, those pieces around work and family and the resiliency in families in terms of there are some families that you will encounter that will simply be okay regardless of the circumstances that they might be faced with or the barriers that are there in front of them. Um, the systems framework in terms of for assessing families is really looking at family assessment instruments, and there are a number of them that we'll briefly kind of blow or look through. Um, Strength-based and risk assessment. So when you're looking at that family, that unit, that's primary job is to look at launching its offspring to be responsible members of society. These are some of the tools that we use to do those assessments. So um, these are popular tools that have been out for a little bit that really give us a good sense of really getting to understand how families function. The systems concept also really looks at family homeostasis, and we all know that homeostasis talks about balance. And so paying attention during assessment to really looking at family rules and the content and process levels of family interaction. So all families, the family that you grew up in, the family that you're a part of now, have rules about how it should be regulated, how the members should be treated, what some of the roles are for the people that are in those particular families. And then we also have what happens or consequences for violation of those rules, whether there's flexibility in those particular rules, and causes for assessing rules. So families have structures within themselves that govern how folks in that particular community operate. Some of these rules are written, some of these rules are kind of unknown, and well, not necessarily unknown, but just unspoken. But people understand what they actually are if you've been a part of that family. The other concept to keep in mind is how those families interact. So what's the level of interaction? How is it sequenced? Um, are there circular explanations for behavior? So when we think about sequence of interactions, in assessing a family, I might pay attention to uh, who speaks the most, who seems to have the power in the family relationship. I also look at who might be responding primarily to that person who's in power, and really gauge what those responses are about. Is it supportive of what the person is saying, or is it controversial, or is there tension there? I might pay attention to who talks first, who talks next. I might pay attention to where people sit while the process is going on. So all of those things give us some idea about this whole looking at the family as a concept. So also, when we're looking at family assessment, we're looking at these guidelines. Um, so the things that are here that are listed in blue are things that you want to pay attention to in terms of doing that assessment and doing a nice thorough assessment. We're also wanting to spend some time looking at dimensions of family assessment, and this is a continuation of that. So family context, what kind of diversity exists within the group? Is it an immigrant family that's relocating to this country or from some different part of the world? What's the family form? What are their strengths? What boundaries do they have in terms of external family boundaries? So who's let into the family, who's not? What are some of the variants or things that are different based on culture and what we know about culture? How are Latino families maybe different than families that are white, that are different maybe than families that are Native American, that are different than maybe families that are from Africa or African American? So again, really looking at the variations within those particular cultures in terms of how they view family and what's important. Whether families are engaged or disengaged, whether they're connected, and what their involvement is with those external systems are all things that you have to pay attention to in terms of the assessment. So when we're looking at these dimensions of family assessment, we're looking at the family power structure. We're looking at how power is discerned, wielded, and distributed within the family system. And that might look different depending on the culture that you may be in. So it's important to really understand some of those dynamics and be careful not to impose our own viewpoint or Western orientation on what one may be seeing in a family where that may not be as relevant. Looking at also power shifts, and really through that lens of multiculturalism, it's really important to really understand how that particular work, assessing where the power is, who has not. Then the decision-making process. How do families make a decision? Is it dad that says, I have the final word, or is there a conversation? Is it more of a collaborative approach to really looking at a complex problem that involves and accepts input from everybody in the family? So these are things that are going to be important for you to understand as you move forward in terms of your work with families. Looking at the family goals, looking at some of the myths that are there, looking at some of the patterns, looking at the roles, looking at who does what, and that will vary pretty profoundly based on culture and based on race and ethnicity in terms of what some of those roles actually look like. We also want to pay attention to communication style. Is there congruence in clarity in communication? Are folks saying what they mean and meaning what they say? Are we paying attention to the nonverbal gestures as well as the verbal messages? Are we looking at the context in terms of how things are said and why they're said in the manner that they are? What are some of the barriers to communications? Who can receive these? What are some of the receiver skills you're noticing, or the sender skills, as well as the responses to acknowledging strengths, achievement, and to accredit growth. So these are all parts of that very complex assessment process that we will have to do with families to really be thorough to make sure that when we start to look at potential interventions and goals for those particular families or the goals they have for themselves, that they have a clear picture about what has kind of moved us to this particular place. So when we think about those communication barriers, these are things that you also want to take a look at as you are intervening or connecting with families. How often do these issues come about? So let's just take a moment and just kind of take a look at some of the things that families do. And you might even be able to find some barriers in terms of how your own family communicates in terms of those things, and gives you kind of a better context for how they may manifest themselves in the families that you're working with. We also want to look at life cycle. Where are families in this particular continuum? Because the transition place or the cycle where the family may be or where they are in transition is important in terms of what we assess, what we look at, and what types of interventions or goals or outcomes that we're actually looking for those families. So in these instances where we've got families highlighted in blue, they may actually be experiencing the same type of problems in terms of family functioning, but the outcome and the interventions that we might utilize will more than likely vary based on just the life cycle that folks are in. The issues for a new couple will be different from a family that has been established and been together for several years and there are 5 or 6 children, or there are children, families with adolescents. So the nature of the issues are different. The response to the intervention and the response to the situation will be different based on the life cycle that folks are in. So always make sure that you pay attention to what's happening for families and how long they've been around and connecting together as families, because it plays an important role in making the determination in terms of how we might intervene with them. So that pretty much concludes chapter 10 that we're looking at in terms of our individuals and families class. So again, I would just encourage you to continue to read, continue to make yourself be prepared to actually even think about some of the concepts that we discussed here today and really look at it in the context of your very own family to see whether you can start to see some of those patterns around how people connect, behave, and interact with each other. It's just kind of a way to do some homework to really kind of get a better sense of what that assessment process will look like. As always, we would encourage you to come to class prepared and ready to participate in the exercises and to continue to bring any questions that you might have as it relates to the topic for today's lesson. So thank you, and I will see you in class.